the quiet of the evening, as the day's bustle recedes and a soft twilight envelops the space, let us embark on an unhurried and tranquil journey to the heart of the ancient world, the enigmatic Oracle of Delphi. Allow yourself to be immersed in the atmosphere of bygone eras, where every stone holds echoes of millennia-old stories. Imagine yourself a traveller walking a winding, dusty mountain path in ancient Greece. The gentle Mediterranean sun warms your shoulders as you steadily climb higher and higher up the steep slopes of sacred Mount Parnassus. Below, as far as the eye can see, stretch endless olive groves, like a green carpet unfurling towards the distant, shimmering sea. Your path, however, does not lead to the coast. You continue your ascent, following a trail that, over hundreds of years, has been polished by the thousands of feet that carried hopes and questions here. Turn on a fan, letting its soft hum become the backdrop for our narrative, and let our journey begin. As you proceed, you start to notice other travellers sharing your path. An Athenian merchant, his donkey laden with pottery destined for sale. Nearby, a farmer's wife carefully carries a small offering wrapped in fine linen. And there, a young soldier, still clad in bronze armour, though his shield is strapped to his back, and his spear rests calmly in his hand. All move with the same quiet yet profound purpose. All are ascending to the same sacred destination. All of you are headed to Delphi, the most revered and sacred place in the entire ancient Greek world, a place where the radiant Apollo himself, it was believed, descended to converse with mortals. But the question arises, how did this mountain slope acquire such incredible significance? How did an ordinary rocky slope, overgrown with wild laurel trees, transform into the spiritual and cultural epicenter of the entire ancient world? The history of this place is rooted in deep antiquity, long before the emergence of majestic temples and priests, when the world was still young, and mighty old gods freely walked the earth. This mountain slope was sacred even then, but not to Apollo. Long ago, before the golden-haired god of music, poetry, and prophecy chose this place as his home, it belonged to an entirely different, much older being. Deep beneath the rocks, in a cave that yawned like a giant maw in the mountainside, dwelt Python, and this was no mere small snake basking on a garden wall. Python was monstrous, a serpent so immense that, coiling around the mountain, its mighty body, legend has it, created the very paths by which travellers now ascend to the summit. Python was ancient, even when the world was just beginning, born from the earth itself. Some traditions recount that when the great waters of Deucalion's flood finally receded, leaving the land muddy and fertile, this gigantic serpent had dwelled in its cave for so long that the local inhabitants built their own sacred traditions and rites around it. An oracle already existed in this cave, a sacred way for mortals to communicate with divine powers. However, this oracle served older gods, primordial earth forces that ruled the world before thunderous Zeus and his Olympian family seized the celestial throne. People from all corners of the Greek world came here to pose their questions to Python's oracle. They brought offerings of honey and barley cakes, and a priestess, clad in ritual garments, interpreted the serpent's movements, the faint tremor of the earth as Python stirred in its deep cave, and the mysterious patterns of steam rising from cracks in the rock. This was a peaceful and centuries-old arrangement, continuing for many generations, until golden-haired Apollo decided this place should belong to him. Apollo was still young at the time, by God's standards. He was born on the floating island of Delos with his twin sister Artemis. His mother, Leto, wandered the world in search of a safe place to give birth, because Hera, consumed as always by jealousy over Zeus's children with other women, had forbidden any land from receiving her. But Apollo grew astonishingly fast, as is characteristic of divine children. Just a few days after his birth, he was already tall, incredibly handsome, and powerful. His golden hair caught the light as if woven from sunbeams. His voice, when he sang, could make even stones weep with its wondrous beauty, and he inherited from his father Zeus an unyielding determination to achieve what he desired. Apollo craved his own oracle, his own sacred place where mortals could come to inquire about the future. But he didn't want just any mountain or any cave. He sought the best. He wanted the most famous and revered oracle in the known world. He wanted Delphi. So Apollo ascended the mountain path, much as you might walk it today, though his divine feet likely raised no dust, and his breath certainly did not quicken from the effort of the climb. Gods do not pant. When he reached the sacred cave, he called out to Python. What happened next depends on who tells this ancient story. Some traditions assert it was a grand battle, with Python's massive coils crushing trees and Apollo's silver arrows flying like falling stars, tearing through the air. Others say it was more a cosmic negotiation, filled with majestic divine postures and threats, but without much physical violence. But what we know for certain is that when this fateful encounter concluded, Python was dead, and Apollo claimed the cave and the entire oracle as his own. One might have expected Apollo to simply adopt existing traditions, letting everything continue as always. But Apollo was a god of change, of new ideas, of the order that springs from art, music, and deliberate thought. The old earth oracle was mysterious and primal, all of steam, serpent dreams, and ancient wisdom rising from the deep recesses of the mountain. Apollo's oracle was to be different, more ordered and elevated. First, he needed to purify the place. The ancient Greeks believed that death, even the death of something as ancient and powerful as Python, left a spiritual stain that needed to be removed before new sacred work could begin. So Apollo performed rituals of purification, burning fragrant herbs, pouring wine and oil on the stones, and chanting hymns that echoed from the mountain peaks. But even purification was not enough. Apollo had killed Python, and in the ancient world, that made him a killer. Even gods had to account for murder. So Apollo departed his new sanctuary and journeyed far to the land of the Hyperboreans in the distant north, where he spent 8 years in exile, atoning for Python's death. 8 long years. Imagine this mountain without its new god, empty of pilgrims, with a dark and quiet cave. The local inhabitants must have wondered if their sacred place would ever live again. The merchants, farmers, and soldiers who had ascended the mountain path for generations must have felt lost, cut off from the divine guidance they had always known. But after 8 years, Apollo returned. And when he returned, he brought with him the most beautiful temple the ancient world had ever seen. In truth, it wasn't quite like that. Apollo didn't so much bring a temple as inspire people to build it. The returned god filled the local communities with a kind of divine enthusiasm, a shared vision of what this sacred place could become. Stonemasons began to arrive from all over Greece, along with architects, artists, and craftsmen of all kinds. The temple they built was designed to be perfect in every way. Its columns were precisely proportioned according to mathematical principles that would later be called the golden ratio. Its sculptures were carved by the greatest artists of the era. And inside, in the Holy of Holies, where only the priestess could enter, Apollo placed his sacred tripod, a three-legged bronze seat that would become the throne of his Oracle. But wait, if Apollo was a god who spoke through an oracle, why did he need a priestess at all? Why didn't he simply speak directly to the people who came with questions? This is one of those amazing mysteries of the ancient world that we will probably never fully understand. Perhaps Apollo, being a god of harmony and balance, believed that divine truth had to be filtered through human understanding to be useful to mortal minds. Perhaps the overwhelming power of a god's direct voice would have been too great for ordinary people. Or perhaps, and this explanation makes the most sense if one considers it calmly and thoughtfully, perhaps Apollo understood that the very act of asking questions and seeking guidance was as important as the answers themselves. Think about it. You climb a dusty mountain path for hours, feeling tired and expectant. You wait in line with other pilgrims, each one nervous, full of hope and uncertainty. You bring your offering and speak your question aloud to the priestess, who serves as the voice of the god, an intermediary between worlds. And then you listen, truly listen, to the answer you receive. This entire process transforms you. The journey, the waiting, the moment of asking the question itself, the careful attention to the answer, all of it together creates a kind of meditation, a deep reflection on your life and your choices that you might never have undertaken if Apollo had simply appeared in your living room and answered your questions while you folded laundry. The Oracle at Delphi was not merely a source of information about the future. It was an experience of seeking wisdom, a spiritual discipline of asking the right questions and being genuinely open to guidance, even if that guidance might not be what you wanted to hear. And Apollo's oracle became famous for giving directives that were technically accurate, but required careful interpretation. The god was not trying to be difficult or mysterious simply for the sake of mystery. He taught people to deeply consider their choices, to examine many possibilities, to approach important decisions with the kind of careful reflection that leads to true wisdom. But what were these answers, and how did they change the fates of entire empires? We will discover that next time as we continue our immersion into the mysteries of Delphi. For centuries, people streamed to Delphi in an unending torrent. It was truly an astonishing influx. Monarchs and farmers, warriors and merchants, young newlyweds and anxious mothers, sages, poets and statesmen, all converged here. Their journey led from the most distant corners of the Hellenic world, and over time from lands extending far beyond its borders. With them, they carried generous gifts, shining gold and shimmering silver, intricate bronze tripods and exquisite fine fabrics, sacrificial animals and humble wildflowers gathered along the way to the sacred mountain. Gradually, as years, decades, and even centuries passed, Apollo's oracle at Delphi transformed, moving beyond the confines of a mere sanctuary. It ascended to the status of a genuine spiritual epicenter for an entire civilization. It was a place where Hellenes from various city-states found common ground for meeting, where momentous decisions were made regarding the initiation of wars and the conclusion of peace, the founding of new colonies, the creation of laws and the holding of festivals, and where divine guidance was sought on the great questions of human existence. The deity, once appearing as a young and audacious rebel who boldly seized another's sacred cave, driven by his own ambitions, ultimately created something truly reverent, a place where the heavens seemed to touch the earth, where the boundless wisdom of the gods could address the finite anxieties and aspirations of human hearts. And when, late at night, the last pilgrim, having received their answer, began the return journey down the mountainside, when the flames of the temple lamps barely flickered, and Parnassus plunged into tranquil darkness, Apollo himself would sometimes take up his golden lyre. He would draw from it wondrous sounds that echoed from the peaks to the deepest valleys. This music was of such unearthly beauty that even wild beasts dared to approach the temple steps to listen. It seemed to embody all the joy and sorrow of mortal existence, transforming them into something eternal and perfect. The god whose destiny it was to foresee the future found his true purpose. It lay not merely in foretelling coming events, but in inspiring people to deep reflection on what was to come. His mission was not merely to answer questions, but to teach mortals to ask more meaningful and profound questions. And the coming dawn, when the sun would once again rise over Mount Parnassus, and the temple columns would catch the first rays of light, would bring new pilgrims. They would begin their ascent along the ancient path, stepping in the footsteps of countless seekers who had come here before them. All harbored the hope of hearing the voice of a god who chose to communicate through human wisdom, rather than through direct divine command. However, how did the oracle actually function in its daily operations? What was it like to live and work in the most revered place of the ancient world? Let us ascend a little higher up the mountainside and observe the cock's crow, as the first pale rays of light touch the peaks of Parnassus. In the valley, shrouded in the gentle cloak of pre-dawn gloom, the world still slumbers. But here in Delphi, the sacred space is already stirring to life. A man awakens in his small stone house, nestled snugly on the hillside, one of dozens of similar structures that cluster around the majestic temple, like children gathered at their mother's skirt. Through a narrow window he sees the columns of the sanctuary, which are already beginning to catch the early dawn light. Their marble surfaces gradually ignite with a warm, honeyed glow, making them appear less like stone and more like frozen sunlight. This is his dwelling. He is one of many who reside here year-round, whose entire lives are centered around maintaining this sacred site and serving the thousands of pilgrims who ascend the mountain, seeking Apollo's guidance. His day, like every day in Delphi, begins with a ritual of purification. Before he can set foot on sacred ground, before he is permitted to touch any sacred objects or begin his duties, he must cleanse himself of the defilement of the mundane world. He descends the hillside to the Castalian spring, where crystal-clear, icy water ceaselessly gushes from the depths of the mountain, flowing in an unbroken stream to the valley below. This spring is revered as sacred to both Apollo and the Muses, the 9 divine sisters who grant inspiration to all forms of art, poetry, and music. Ancient traditions hold that anyone who tastes the water from this spring or bathes in its currents will be blessed with the gift of poetry. For him and the other temple attendants, however, the spring serves a more pragmatic function. Its cool, invigorating waters are the ideal means to wash away the remnants of sleep and prepare the mind for the sacred work ahead. At the spring, he is not alone. Other early risers are already present. Temple priests perform their morning ablutions, their figures majestically bowed over the water. Several pilgrims who arrived late in the night hasten to purify themselves before daring to approach the oracle. Even some local shepherds, leading their flocks to graze on the mountainsides, join this morning ritual. All exchange polite nods, but conversation is kept to hushed whispers. The early morning hours in Delphi are a time for deep, quiet reflection, when the sacred aura of the place penetrates to the very bones. Having washed his hands and face and offered a brief prayer to Apollo, he ascends back towards the temple, but does not proceed directly there. Other duties await. Him first. He works in the Athenian treasury, one of the many elegant marble structures that line the sacred way along which pilgrims make their ascent to the temple. Each of these treasuries was erected by a separate Greek city-state, not only to store its gifts to Apollo, but also to showcase its own abundance and piety before the eyes of visitors from rival polis. The Athenian treasury stands out for its particular beauty. Its walls are adorned with magnificent marble reliefs depicting the heroic adventures of Theseus and Heracles. However, now, in the diffused pre-dawn light, his thoughts are occupied less by artistic merit than by purely practical matters. He needs to check the locks, ensure there have been no attempts at intrusion during the night, and prepare the room for the day's visitors. Inside the treasury, the air is cool and still. Golden artifacts softly gleam in the subdued light that filters through the doorway. Here one can see tripods crafted from precious metals. Their 3 legs are skillfully carved in the shape of snakes, serving as a tribute to Python, slain by Apollo. There are also silver bowls, intricately engraved with scenes of battles and festive celebrations, bronze mirrors polished to perfection, their surfaces reflecting the viewer's face like dark, calm water. However, the most valuable of all treasures are those offerings that cannot be publicly displayed. These are papyrus and parchment scrolls, preserving records of every prophecy uttered by Apollo's oracle over many generations. These priceless documents constitute the true treasure of Delphi. They far surpass in significance all the gold and silver combined, representing hundreds of years of divine guidance, a written testament to how the god's will shaped the history of the Hellenic world. He meticulously checks each container, ensuring that the scrolls are securely protected from moisture and rodents. Some of these prophecies were known throughout the ancient world. Others were private in nature, given to ordinary people who came with everyday questions. Should I marry this person? Will my sick child recover? Is this a good time to plant crops? As he works, the temple gradually comes alive around him with sounds. Footsteps on the stone paths, the soft rustle of brooms sweeping dust from the pristine marble floors, the gentle lowing of cattle being led up the slope for sacrifice, and quiet voices exchanging greetings as the numerous temple attendants begin their daily duties. By the time he finishes his work in the treasury, the sun has fully illuminated the eastern peaks, and the entire temple area is bathed in golden light. Now comes the most beautiful part of his day, the morning procession. Every day in Delphi invariably begins with a solemn procession, moving from the sacred spring to the temple. Priests, clad in immaculate white robes and crowned with laurel wreaths, walk slowly along the sacred way, while musicians draw melodic sounds from flutes and lyres. The melody is always the same, an ancient hymn to Apollo, which has been performed in Delphi for so many generations that its original author's name has long been lost to memory. He joins this procession along with all the other temple attendants and those pilgrims who arrived early enough to participate in this ritual. The pace of movement is deliberately slow, meditative in character. It is not merely a way of getting from one point to another. It is a carefully structured rite that helps all its participants, priests, attendants, and pilgrims, make the transition from the mundane world of everyday concerns into the sacred realm where deities converse with mortals. As he proceeds, he passes all the treasuries and monuments that brought Delphi worldwide fame. His gaze sweeps over the Cnidian treasury with its amazing marble caryatids, columns skillfully carved in the form of graceful female figures supporting the roof on their heads. Next, the Naxian monument, topped by a majestic sphinx carved from a single block of marble. And of course the Theban treasury, where Alexander the Great himself once came to seek Apollo's blessing before setting out to conquer the world. Each of these structures carries its own story. Each symbolizes a triumph or a tragedy, a pivotal moment when a Greek polis felt obligated to offer thanks to Apollo for his guidance or to seek his protection. Passing them each morning, he realizes again and again that Delphi is not just a religious sanctuary. It is a place where the entire Hellenic world converges to reflect on its past and chart the course of its future. The procession reaches the temple precisely as the morning sacrifice begins. A perfectly white bull, its horns skillfully gilded and its body adorned with garlands of fragrant flowers, is led to the altar that stands before the main entrance of the sanctuary. The animal appears remarkably calm, almost serene in the warm light of the morning sun. The priests examine it with utmost care, searching for the slightest blemish or sign of infirmity that might render it unsuitable as an offering to the god. But this bull is flawless, as always. The people of Delphi take deep pride in offering only the best to Apollo. The animal is swiftly and humanely sacrificed. Its blood spills on the ancient altar stones while prayers and hymns ascend to the brightening sky. This sacrificial rite serves several crucial purposes. It provides meat for the temple kitchens, where hundreds of people must be fed daily. It generates sacred smoke, which, like an invisible bridge, carries human pleas to the realm of the gods. And finally, it establishes the necessary ritual purity that makes it possible for Apollo to speak through his oracle. The oracle, as is well known, does not deliver prophecies daily. In fact, her lips open for predictions only once a month, on the 7th day after the new moon, a date especially revered in honor of Apollo's birth. And even then, this occurs only if the omens are favorable, when the gods clearly indicate their readiness to converse with mortals on that particular day. Today is not a time for the oracle's prophecies. Today is what the priests call a maintenance day, a period set aside for thorough cleaning and organization of temple affairs, for receiving visitors who wish to present gifts or seek clarification regarding temple rituals. It is also a time for meticulously copying important documents and updating records that track which cities have fulfilled their obligatory tributes to Apollo. Thus, instead of the intense mystical aura that typically envelops the oracle's prophecy sessions, today there is a more relaxed, almost domestic atmosphere. Temple attendants diligently sweep dust from the smooth marble floors and polish bronze details to a dazzling shine. Scribes, settled in shaded corners, assiduously transcribe ancient prophecies onto fresh papyrus scrolls. Artisans, their hammers melodically clinking against stone and metal, are engaged in repairing damage to buildings and monuments. For most of the morning, the sanctuary guardian spends his time helping to catalogue new offerings that arrived with yesterday's pilgrims. Among them is an elegant silver bowl from Corinth, engraved with a prayer for Apollo's protection of merchant ships. Nearby lies a bronze mirror from Sparta, a gift from a woman whose son recovered from a fever after her prayers to the god. Also notable is a tiny ivory statuette, brought from some distant colony, skillfully carved and depicting Apollo playing the lyre. Each offering requires careful recording: who presented it, when it occurred, and what Apollo was asked for. These records serve both practical and spiritual purposes. On the practical side, they help temple administrators track their immense wealth and ensure that nothing is lost or stolen. In a spiritual sense, they preserve the memory of each person's relationship with the god, creating a kind of continuous dialogue between Apollo and his worshippers, spanning generations. Around midday, as the sun reaches its zenith and the marble columns cast sharp shadows on the temple floor, the daytime visitors begin to arrive. These are not the urgent pilgrims seeking prophecies. These individuals are, in a sense, tourists. Affluent Greeks from various cities eager to see the famous Oracle site, make modest offerings, and then recount to their friends back home about visiting the most sacred place in the civilized world. The sanctuary guardian often acts as a guide for these visitors, leading them through the sacred precinct and explaining the history and significance of the various buildings and monuments. He enjoys this task, as it provides an opportunity to view Delphi with fresh eyes, to reappreciate how astonishing this place must appear to people who do not live here permanently. This building, he explains to a well-dressed merchant from Rhodes pointing to a small but elegant treasury, was erected to commemorate the great victory at Marathon. The Athenians sought to thank Apollo for his assistance in defeating the Persians, so they dedicated 1/10 of all the spoils taken in that battle. The merchant nods approvingly. Like most Greeks, he is well versed in the history of Marathon. However, the site of the treasury itself, housing Persian gold and silver, makes the famous battle more real, more tangible. The Guardian shows him the tripods won by triumphant athletes at the Pythian Games, a grand festival of Apollo that gathers participants from across the Mediterranean every 4 years. He points to the statue of Gelon of Syracuse, commissioned after his victory over the Carthaginians. He then explains how the sacred way was designed to create a sense of ascent to the divine, where each turn of the path reveals new wonders, while building anticipation for the temple crowning the summit. The merchant asks insightful questions. He inquires how priests are chosen, how the oracle's prophecies are recorded, and whether ordinary people like himself can request a consultation with Apollo. The sanctuary guardian answers to the best of his ability, though some aspects of the oracle's operation remain secret to all but the highest-ranking priests. However, he can share what it is like to live in this sacred place every day, how the morning light on the marble columns never grows old, never becomes commonplace, how the sound of hymns echoing through the mountaintops imbues even the most routine tasks with meaning, how the constant stream of pilgrims from all corners of the known world makes Delphi feel like the center of the universe, the one place where all the disparate threads of human experience converge. As the day draws to a close, the mountain begins to cast long shadows across the sacred precinct. Tourists descend to find lodging in the town below. Temple workers finish their daily tasks and gather for the evening meal in a communal dining hall built on the hillside beneath the temple. The food is simple but nourishing. Bread baked fresh each morning. Cheese from the milk of goats grazing on the mountain slopes. Olives and olive oil. Wine diluted with water according to Greek custom. Meat from the morning sacrifice cooked over fragrant wood fires. Fresh fruits and vegetables brought from the valleys below. But the true sustenance comes from the conversations around the long wooden tables. Priests, scribes, and craftsmen share the events of their day. Someone mentions a particularly beautiful offering that arrived from Egypt. Another describes a problem with one of the treasury roofs that will require attention before the winter rains. Begin. A young priest recounts his research into ancient prophecies, trying to discern patterns in Apollo's guidance over the centuries. The conversation is never rushed, never tense. There is something about living in a sacred place that makes people more thoughtful, more patient with one another. Disputes are settled quickly and fairly. Gossip is gentle and good-natured. All understand that they are part of something greater than themselves, something that will continue long after they are gone. As full darkness descends upon the mountain, oil lamps are lit throughout the sacred precinct. The columns of the temple softly glow in their light, creating islands of warm radiance in the surrounding darkness. The night sounds begin, the distant bark of a fox, the soft hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind through the laurel trees that grow profusely on the mountainside. The sanctuary guardian makes a final round of the treasury, checking the locks and ensuring that everything is securely protected for the night. Then he climbs back up the hillside to his small stone house, carrying an oil lamp to light his way along the familiar path. Before falling asleep, he steps outside and looks at the stars. Here on the mountain, they seem closer, brighter, and more numerous than ever in the valleys below. On some nights, when the air is particularly clear and still, he can almost imagine hearing music emanating from the celestial spheres. Apollo's lyre, perhaps, playing melodies too beautiful for mortal ears. Tomorrow will bring another day of routine tasks, another stream of visitors and pilgrims, another opportunity to serve the God who made this mountain the most sacred place in the ancient world. But tonight, as he drifts to sleep, he feels the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful work, from being part of something eternal and important. And in his dreams he sometimes hears the voice of the Oracle herself, the mysterious priestess speaking for Apollo. When the gods choose to reveal the future to mortal minds. Her words are always wise, always true, though their meaning is not always immediately clear. Her name was never recorded in any of the official temple documents. None of the Pythias were ever identified by their personal names in the sacred records. They were simply Pythias, women who spoke for Apollo, whose individual identity was completely absorbed by their divine function. But let us call her Clio, after the muse of history, for her story deserves to be remembered, even if her true name has been lost to time. Clio was chosen as Pythia when she was in her 50s. Her hair was already touched with noble grey. Her face was lined with gentle wrinkles that appear from decades of wisdom and life experience. This was not by chance. Apollo's priests had, over the centuries, ascertained that young women, however intelligent or spiritually gifted, rarely possessed the inner strength and stability required to serve as the voice of a god. To be an oracle was not merely to receive divine inspiration. It meant enduring the overwhelming power of a god's presence, maintaining one's sanity and sense of self while serving as a conduit for divine knowledge. It demanded the kind of deep, unwavering calm that usually comes only with age and accumulated experience. Clio was born in a small village in the foothills of Delphi, the daughter of a potter who crafted simple clayware for local farmers and shepherds. In her youth, she married a blacksmith and raised 4 children, 2 of whom she buried in childhood, a tragically common occurrence in the ancient world, and 2 others grew up to establish their own families. She survived wars and famine, abundant and meagre harvests, the ordinary joys and sorrows that comprise most human lives. She prayed to Apollo in difficult times and offered thanks during prosperous ones. She ascended the mountain path to Delphi many times over the years, sometimes to seek advice, sometimes simply to participate in the festivals that brought the entire region together in solemn celebration. For many years, the priests had closely observed her, though she herself was unaware of it. They noted the ready willingness of others to seek her wise counsel when communal disagreements and disputes arose. The temple elders saw how she maintained an astonishing composure and deep discernment, even in the most tense and critical moments. They witnessed her genuine, unostentatious piety, not the demonstrative, demanding religious fervor that seeks only spectacular signs and miracles, but a deep, unwavering faith that silently trusted divine wisdom, even when understanding that wisdom seemed unattainable. When the previous Pythia, having completed her earthly journey, passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73, the priests dedicated long months to fervent prayers and careful deliberations. They sought guidance from Apollo himself to understand who should fill such a responsible role. The deity's answer came to them in a series of dreams and omens that unanimously pointed to the humble potter's daughter from the village below. Clio, whose name was called, felt simultaneously profound honor, overwhelming fear, and complete unpreparedness for the grand demands that her new, sacred life would place upon her. The first stage of her new path involved rigorous purification rituals. For 30 days, Clio resided in a specially designated dwelling within the consecrated precinct, adhering to an austere diet. Her sustenance consisted only of humble bread, a little cheese, pure water, and lightly diluted wine. Daily she performed ablutions in the sacred Castalian spring, washing away not only the worldly impurities of the body, but, equally important, releasing herself from the accumulated attachments and daily concerns of her former life. The priests meticulously taught her ancient hymns and prayers that had been passed down by word of mouth, from one Pythia to another, through many generations. Some of these chants were so archaic that their language was barely recognizable as Greek. Nevertheless, their melodies possessed an extraordinary power to transform consciousness, preparing the mind for direct communion with the divine. She also mastered the art of recognizing sacred signs that indicated Apollo's readiness to utter prophecies through her. This could be a faint rustle of laurel leaves in perfectly still air, or a particular unique pattern of steam rising from the sacred spring on certain days, or a unique quality of light, as if condensing around the temple's Holy of Holies, presaging the deity's presence. However, the most important and undoubtedly the most challenging lesson for her was the complete renunciation of her own will, of personal thoughts, desires, and formed opinions. She was to become like an empty vessel, entirely ready to receive and contain divine knowledge. This requirement proved to be the greatest test, for Clio had spent half a century meticulously forming her individuality, her unique way of comprehending life's problems and making decisions. Now she needed to set aside all these deeply ingrained habits to achieve a state of absolute receptiveness to anything Apollo wished to convey through her, becoming his flawless conduit. On her first occasion to serve as oracle, Clio was overcome with such intense nervousness that she could barely take a few steps from the temple entrance to the sacred tripod where she was to sit, to receive divine inspiration. Her hands trembled noticeably as she adjusted the folds of her pristine white robes. Her voice broke and quavered as she uttered the introductory prayers. The pilgrim who came for advice that day was a middle-aged farmer from Boeotia. His question was both agonizingly simple and deeply personal. His wife had remained barren for 15 years of their marriage, and he desperately wished to know if Apollo could guide him to having children. Clio sat down on the three-legged bronze seat and closed her eyes. She breathed deeply and evenly, trying to still her wildly beating heart and open her mind to the deity's presence. For a long time, absolutely nothing happened. Confusion, verging on panic, began to overwhelm her. Had Apollo made a mistake in his choice? Was she destined to suffer a shameful failure at the most culminating moment of her new, sacred mission? And then, suddenly, the god was there. This sensation was not like possession by an alien spirit, as some ancient authors mistakenly believed. Rather, it was akin to her becoming something more than merely human, as if her consciousness had expanded immeasurably to encompass knowledge and perspectives that no mortal mind could ordinarily grasp. She felt the farmer's deep, boundless love for his wife, his mounting despair, and how their childlessness cast a dark shadow over their entire marriage. However, beyond the surface of his question, she also saw deeper patterns of his destiny. With divine clarity, it became clear to her that his wife's barrenness was not a curse or punishment, but merely one of those inexplicable sorrows that sometimes touch human lives. And she also distinctly saw that a child awaited them, not born of his wife's flesh, but already existing in this world, desperately in need of parents capable of giving him their love. When Clio finally spoke, her voice sounded different even to herself. It was deeper, more resonant, and filled with absolute, undeniable certainty. The child you seek is not the child you expect. Look beyond your blood, and you will find a son who has long awaited your love. The farmer left, somewhat confused, but also filled with hope. 3 months later, he returned to offer thanks to Apollo. A neighboring village had been struck by plague, leaving many orphaned children. He and his wife adopted a 7-year-old boy whose parents had passed away, and from the moment they brought him into their home, their dwelling was filled with the ineffable joy they had sought for so many years. News of the successful prophecy spread rapidly, as it always did when the oracle's guidance proved strikingly accurate and brought invaluable benefit. More and more pilgrims began to journey to Delphi, bringing with them questions both deeply philosophical and utterly mundane. One young man inquired which path he should choose, to become a warrior or a merchant. Clio, speaking with Apollo's voice, informed him that his greatest triumphs would be achieved not on battlefields or trade routes, but through the power of words. Subsequently, he became renowned as one of Athens's most distinguished orators. Representatives of a city came with a question about the advisability of founding a new colony overseas. The oracle instructed them to seek a place where Apollo's ravens gathered in unusually large numbers. Such a place was found on the coast of modern-day Turkey, and a prosperous trading port was established there. A mother brought her sick child, asking if the fever would subside. Apollo's answer was ambiguous and metaphorical. The tree that bends in the storm survives, while the stubborn oak falls. The woman interpreted this as a call to stop force-feeding the child, allowing his body to rest and recover on its own. The fever receded within days. As months passed, Clio delved deeper into her role as a herald of the divine will, experiencing a growing familiarity. She learned to unreservedly trust the flow of divine knowledge passing through her, even if it sometimes contradicted her own human understanding of the situation. Over time, she developed her own methods for managing this intensely spiritual experience of transmitting Apollo's consciousness. These included special breathing exercises, deep meditative practices, and particular ways of preparing her mind and body for the overpowering presence of comprehensive divine wisdom. However, she also realized that being an oracle required more than simply receiving sacred messages. It entailed the ability to translate these messages into a language that ordinary mortals could understand and apply in their lives. Apollo's knowledge was boundless and timeless. He saw all possible options, all consequences, all the interconnected patterns that shape human destiny. But human minds think linearly, in concrete images, within stories with clear beginnings and ends. Therefore, Clio learned to be not only a conduit, but also a skilled interpreter. When Apollo revealed vast, multidimensional truths about someone's future, she had to find ways to compress this all-encompassing knowledge into concise, easily memorable phrases that nonetheless guided the inquirer toward wise and conscious choices. At times, this meant uttering prophecies in the form of riddles and metaphors that required deep and thoughtful consideration to grasp their true meaning. The most celebrated oracles in history often spoke obscurely not because Apollo sought mystery for its own sake, but because some truths were so vast and multifaceted that they could not be conveyed directly. When King Croesus inquired whether he should attack the mighty Persian Empire, Apollo revealed to Clio a vision of grand armies clashing in deadly battle, burning cities, and an ancient kingdom reduced to ruins. However, he also showed her that the king's question itself was fundamentally flawed. Croesus was interested only in military strategy, whereas he should have inquired about wisdom, justice, and the proper use of power. Thus came the oracle's famous reply: "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great kingdom." Croesus, in his own understanding, assumed this meant the destruction of the Persian Empire. Only after his crushing defeat did he realize that the great kingdom he destroyed was his own. The prophecy proved absolutely accurate, but it also served as a harsh lesson in humility, a reminder that even monarchs must carefully weigh their assumptions and true motivations before undertaking actions capable of affecting the fates of thousands of people. The life of an oracle inevitably entailed deep, pervasive solitude. Clio could never afford to accidentally reveal what she saw or felt while serving as a conduit for Apollo's consciousness. She was strictly forbidden to use divine knowledge for her own benefit or to assist her family and friends. She had to maintain impeccable neutrality and unwavering fairness, treating the concerns of mighty kings and simple peasants with equal reverence and attention. Her former friends from the village below found it exceedingly difficult to comprehend her new, sacred role. How could one engage in ordinary conversation with a person who served as the voice of a god? How could one complain about the whims of the weather or gossip about neighbors with a woman who had access to universal divine wisdom. For this reason, Clio's closest relationships were formed with other members of the temple personnel, the priests who meticulously prepared her for each oracle session, the scribes who diligently recorded her prophecies, and the attendants who maintained the sacred space where she performed her mission. They understood the full weight of the burden she carried. They saw how exhausted she was after each session of communion with the god, and how sometimes she required entire days to recover from the incredible spiritual intensity of transmitting divine consciousness. They respected her privacy and her need for silence, yet they invariably cared for her and offered her comprehensive support. During those times when she was not performing her duties as oracle, which, in essence, constituted the majority of her existence, as prophecies were uttered only once a month, Clio led a secluded life within the sacred precinct. She tended a small garden where she meticulously cultivated herbs intended for use in temple rituals. Her hands diligently spun wool and wove cloth, meeting the essential needs of the temple. Beyond this, she immersed herself in studying the ancient records of previous prophecies, striving to discover hidden patterns that might deepen her understanding of the ways Apollo manifested his will to mortals. Sometimes, even before the temple stirred to its daily routine, at the dawn of a new day, she would sit on the steps of Apollo's temple, gazing at the valley stretching below. From this elevated vantage point, her eyes encompassed vistas for many miles in all directions, endless olive groves and lush vineyards, tiny villages, thin wisps of smoke from campfires, and beyond the distant mountain, the shimmering silver of the sea. This majestic landscape invariably reminded her of the divine perspective, of how Apollo could see all of human life spread before him like a vast, intricately woven tapestry. Individual human destinies appeared as mere threads in this grand tapestry, undoubtedly important, yet an integral part of something significantly grander and more complex than any mortal could fully comprehend. In these silent moments, Clio sometimes felt the invisible presence of the god, even when she was not formally acting as his oracle. It was not the overwhelming, transformative experience that accompanied prophecy, but rather a soft, pervasive awareness of divine wisdom flowing through the fabric of creation. She felt Apollo's deep affection for humanity, his sincere desire to help people make choices that would lead them to well-being and genuine happiness. Clio understood, though she could never fully explain to others, that Apollo's prophecies were not arbitrary statements about a predetermined future. They represented guidance based on the natural consequences of human choice, wisdom intended to help people align their actions with the deeper laws of justice and harmony that govern the entire universe. Thus, the oracle was not fortune-telling in the way we might imagine it today. It was rather spiritual counseling, conducted at the highest possible level, divine wisdom applied to human problems, infinite knowledge filtered through perfect compassion. Years passed, relentlessly counting time. Clio's hair turned the shade of purest snow. Wrinkles deepened around her eyes, yet these were not marks of sorrow or anxiety, but rather indicators of wisdom and serenity. She found a peace in her role she had never known in her former life, a sense of complete alignment with her true purpose. Monthly, new pilgrims arrived, bearing the same eternal questions that people had asked since time immemorial. Will I find happiness? Will I succeed in my endeavors? Should I tie my fate to this person? Should I move to that place? How can I know the will of the gods concerning me? And month after month, Clio opened herself to Apollo's boundless wisdom, uttering answers that guided these seekers to more meaningful choices, to a deeper understanding of existence, to a more fulfilling life. In her ordinary human consciousness, she never knew how helpful the advice she conveyed through Apollo's voice had been. Pilgrims, having received prophecies, would immediately depart Delphi, returning to their distant lands to ponder the meaning of the divine words through the prism of their own experience. However, sometimes, years later, someone would return to Delphi to offer Apollo a thank offering. This might be a prosperous merchant who had started his business according to the oracle's instructions, or a happy wife who had chosen her spouse based on divine counsel, or an entire city that had averted disaster by heeding the god's warnings. These return visits were, for Clio as Pythia, the greatest joy in life. They confirmed what she had always believed but could never prove, that Apollo's love for humanity was genuine, that divine wisdom was indeed capable of helping mortals navigate the complexities of earthly existence, and that her own role, as the voice of the god, was truly significant. But even more valuable than the successful prophecies themselves were the lessons she learned about the very nature of divine guidance. Apollo never made decisions for people. He never promised easy or comfortable outcomes. Instead, he helped mortals more clearly perceive their options, more accurately foresee the probable consequences of their actions, and align their decisions with principles of wisdom and justice that would serve them well, regardless of external circumstances. The god, speaking through Clio's lips, taught people to ask deeper questions, rather than simply giving them the answers they thought they wished to hear. He encouraged them to reflect more deeply on their motives and values. He helped them develop an inner wisdom that would serve them throughout their lives, not just in the specific situation that brought them to Delphi. And gradually, over many years of her service as oracle, Clio came to a profound understanding of how divine guidance should truly function, not as a magical resolution to human problems, but as a path to help people become wiser, more thoughtful, more capable of making choices that lead to genuine happiness and fulfillment. When she turned 70, Clio felt Apollo's presence gradually beginning to leave her. Not suddenly, but smoothly, like a slow ebbing tide. She realized that her time as oracle was drawing to a close, and she was ready for this transition. Her last prophecy was given to a young woman who asked a question Clio herself might have asked decades earlier. How do I live a life that has true meaning? Apollo's answer, spoken through the voice of the aging Pythia, was both simple and profound. Listen deeply, speak. Truthfully, choose wisely, love fiercely, the gods ask for nothing more. 3 months later, Clio passed peacefully in her sleep, like her predecessor. The priests discovered her in her small cell within the temple precinct. Her face was serene, her hands folded on a scroll containing one of Apollo's ancient hymns. She was buried with proper honors in the sacred cemetery located on the mountainside above Delphi, her grave marked by a simple stone that identified her only as Pythia, a faithful servant of Apollo. Her personal name, according to her wish, was never recorded. However, her legacy lived on in the wisdom she conveyed, in the guidance she gave, in the lives she helped improve through her service as the voice of the god. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when the mountain mist swirled around the majestic columns of the temple, and the first rays of sun touched the sacred peaks, the priests sometimes imagined they could still hear her voice, deep and resonant with divine authority, uttering truths that would live long after marble crumbled and bronze was covered with the green patina of time. But who were the people who ascended this sacred mountain in search of such wisdom? What compelled ordinary mortals to undertake the difficult and lengthy journey to Apollo's sanctuary? Let us follow some of them along the winding path and listen to the questions that weighed so heavily on their hearts. A messenger arrived in Delphi 3 days before King Croesus himself, bearing gifts so magnificent that even Apollo's priests, men accustomed to receiving offerings from the wealthiest individuals of the ancient world, paused their daily tasks to gaze in astonishment. First appeared a golden lion, life-sized and flawlessly crafted. Its mane was carved with such artistry that each individual hair seemed to catch the morning light. The lion weighed almost 500 pounds of pure gold, and it required 12 men to lift it up the sacred way to Apollo's temple. Following it were gold and silver mixing bowls, each large enough for a person to bathe in, their surfaces adorned with intricate scenes of gods and heroes. There were golden cups and silver amphorae, bronze tripods with snake-shaped legs, and ivory sculptures carved by the greatest artists of the era. But the most impressive gift was a solid gold altar, intended for the permanent adornment of Apollo's temple. The altar was inlaid with prayers in several languages and precious stones gathered from the farthest corners of the known world. The priests meticulously catalogued each item, recording its weight, dimensions, and artistic details in the permanent temple records. But they also whispered among themselves about what these extraordinary gifts might signify. In their long experience, the most generous offerings usually preceded the most desperate questions, and they were right. When King Croesus of Lydia finally arrived in Delphi, accompanied by a retinue of nobles, servants, and guards, his question was simple, yet fraught with consequences that would change the ancient world. Should I wage war against the Persian Empire? To understand why this question held such immense significance, one must envision the political landscape of the ancient world around 550 BCE. For centuries, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean had remained relatively stable. Greek city-states controlled the islands and coastal regions. Various kingdoms, such as Lydia, held sway over the interior of modern-day Turkey. Egypt dominated the south, and far to the east, the Persian Empire was steadily gaining power but had not yet seriously turned its attention to conquering western lands. Croesus ruled the Lydian kingdom from his capital, Sardis, located in modern-day western Turkey. Lydia was incredibly wealthy, so rich that the phrase "as rich as Croesus" is still used to describe a person possessing almost boundless monetary means. The kingdom controlled vital trade routes between Europe and Asia, and its rivers contained gold that Lydian artisans had learned to process with unparalleled skill. But wealth, as Croesus was beginning to realize, could be both a burden and a blessing. The more successful his kingdom became, the more it attracted the attention of ambitious neighbors eager to seize Lydia's treasures. The Persian Empire, under its energetic young king Cyrus, was steadily expanding westward. They had already conquered Media and Babylon, adding the riches and armies of these kingdoms to their growing might. Now, Persian scouts had been sighted near Lydia's eastern borders, and diplomatic messages from the Persian court were growing more demanding in tone. Croesus faced a terrible dilemma. If he were to wait for Persia to strike first, he would have to fight a defensive war on his own territory, with all the destruction that would bring to his people and cities. But if he attacked first, he would initiate a war against an enemy whose full strength still remained unknown, staking his entire kingdom on a single military campaign. Either choice could lead to disaster. Therefore, Croesus decided to do as powerful Greeks had done for generations when faced with intractable problems. He would ask Apollo for guidance. Lydian King Croesus, a man not only of immense wealth, but also exceptional prudence, was not eager to fully entrust his kingdom's fate to the predictions of oracles. He decided to verify the truth of divine prophecy before making a momentous decision. To this end, Croesus dispatched his messengers to 7 different oracles located throughout the ancient world, including the famous Delphi, Dodona, and the Oracle of Ammon in Libya. All were given strict instructions. On the same day, asked the identical question, "What is King Croesus doing at this very moment?" Meanwhile, Croesus himself spent that day engaged in an utterly peculiar and unpredictable activity that no human mind could have guessed. He took a lamb and a tortoise, butchered them,